Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Barrier-Free, Accessible or Inclusive Design, Become a Design for All ally. My name is Felix, and I'm the webinar coordinator at the Continuing Education Department here at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from today. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we begin, I would like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. In order to maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. We highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window. Feel free to submit any questions you may have for our speaker. These will be addressed in the designated Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Kindly note, the chat function will be deactivated following this introduction. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your transcript. Please allow a few weeks for the processing and reporting of these hours. And lastly, please note that the presenter does not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. But now, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today's session. Please welcome Lara Pinchbeck. Lara, I pass it over to you.
Good day. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. Welcome to this discussion this morning. Just a couple of notes for you. I am typically located in Amiskwichiwaskakan, which is colonially known as Edmonton in Treaty 6 in Alberta. I would say I come to this topic to you as somebody with lived experience, with learned experience, with loved experience, and labored experience in terms of understanding and advocating for the experience of people with disabilities and working to make our built environment as accessible as possible. I started off in architecture and have transitioned over through my career to what I call myself as a design anthropologist. So I study and practice learning how design is both a noun and a verb. So I'm looking at both the processes and the products of the design process. So welcome today. First of all, we're going to talk about different ways of accessing physical spaces, especially for people with disabilities or anybody in general when they're hoping to go about their everyday activities. And then we're going to look at a couple of trusted places of information of where you can learn about this. And then lastly, we're going to explore different ways that you as a designer can develop an inclusive mindset and hopefully become an ally for people with disabilities and for everybody everywhere. So one of the interesting things is that all of us at some point are going to experience some form of disabling scenario. This could be on a permanent level, and it could be even situational. So for example, we decide in our frustration or our stubbornness that we're going to carry all of the bags of groceries in from the vehicle to the house. And when we get to the house, it's around a doorknob and it's too hard for us to be able to maneuver all of that. And we end up having to put some bags down to be able to open the door. So we want to look at all of these kind of scenarios when we're designing. And not only do we want to consider present situations, but we also want to consider our future needs. And so it's interesting that our current census data is showing that about 1 in 4 Canadians currently are identifying as having some form of disability. But what we're also seeing is that more than 2/3 of Canadians currently are impacted by somebody who also is adjacent to them. Either they're living with them or they're caring for them who has a disability. And we're recognizing that our spaces are one of the limiting factors in order for people to have high qualities of life. But one of the things I want you to think about is that we're not just designing spaces for special needs or for targeted groups. Ideally, we want to be able to make sure that our designs work for everybody so that they can all have the possibility of a common life. The way that we approach this is typically with a universal design approach. Um, and the key is with universal design, we want to recognize that it isn't just about mobility challenges or about people with disabilities. We're really talking about everybody being able to go everywhere and do the things that they want to do, or expect to do, I should say, as well. So for years, people were asking me just for checklists. And I want to say, sure, checklists are fine. Oftentimes what we the basis of those checklists is really a little bit of a hierarchy in some way. So the first tier that we're thinking about is we want to, of course, make sure that our designed spaces are safe. But that's not the end all. We want to be able to go above and beyond that in some way. And ultimately, what we're hoping is that everybody in those spaces will be able to do what they want to do easily, the minimal amount of stress. We may even want them to be able to enjoy being in that space or be delighted because of something that's happening in that space. So in order to be able to figure out how to get there, I want to just take a couple minutes to go back to some of those terms that I had talked about earlier in the title, whether it's barrier-free, accessible, aging in place, or memory care. And I'm not going to go super nerdy on this. There's a lot of research that explores that. And if you want to, that may be another conversation at some point. But I just want to touch on a couple of them for you because they do get thrown around in different contexts. So with all of the approach that we've got, we want to be able to make sure that people can get into the spaces, that they can move around the spaces that they want, that they can do the things that they're intending to do, and ultimately leave those spaces. So first of all, when we're thinking about barrier-free as a term, it's typically looking at how can we remove the physical barriers that have been identified in the built environment. Those ones can impact the ability for somebody to be able to safely inhabit that space. They tend to focus on architectural features that might make somebody fall or hurt themselves. So, for example, steps where somebody needs to descend, or slopes that are too steep, or even projections that are not easily perceived in the space until you conk your head on them. So, on one hand, I kind of hope that we are all doing this anyway. This is basically what the building code is asking us to deliver as a minimum. And I want to think of it that we're approaching this really as common sense design. Of course, we want to make sure that our spaces are safe. But yet, we continue to see in the environment that there are spaces that are not safe for people. And so we do want to make sure at least that there's that minimum threshold that you're hitting. The other thing that I want you to think about is accessible design. So accessible design actually takes a little bit more of a perspective in terms of a broader application or a more holistic understanding of what the whole ecoscape or the entire journey is that's going to happen. So what we do is we will map out the whole journey that somebody takes to be able to undertake the activity they want to do. And we want to make sure that all of those points where somebody's going to inhabit those spaces are not undermining the ability for somebody to be able to do that task. So it's almost like a string of pearls in some way. We want to make sure that all of those features that are in that space contribute towards somebody being able to do what they want to do. And we might think of this ultimately as meaningful access. So they can do all of the things they want to do. We're starting to look at now a approach to design that goes above just safety, and we're starting to have a lens of looking at it from a functional perspective. So this is where we may want to bring in um, ethnographic information about understanding how people inhabit spaces, or we want to look at human factors conversations where people are mapping out all of the different task activities that they do to be able to determine how efficiently that they're going to do that. So I want to just take a moment here to plug the Rick Hansen Foundation rating system, because this is where we would locate that particular rating system, for example, to understand how that whole context works for people. Now, what I'm seeing in terms of the application when I'm working with my design colleagues and I'm researching the process of their designing, what I'm seeing is that this is typically a process of translation. So, what I mean by that is that they will do their first design in some way, and then with an intention of understanding if somebody can meaningfully access the space, they will then review it all and they will assess to make sure that there aren't any barriers in that space. So it's a little bit of a translation activity rather than initially designing all of the space to ensure that it is 100% accessible from a functional perspective at the get-go. Now, why is this important? Well, what I want to remind you is that one of the reasons why we are trying to address accessible design in general, universal design, is that we really don't want to intentionally design anything that is discriminatory. By merely providing architectural features that are accessible but separate or segregated in some sense, doesn't mean that we're actually making a space that is providing equitable use for everybody, that you're respecting that everybody is a basic human and that they have the rights, really respectfully, to be able to inhabit the space equally. So this is where we may start thinking about inclusive design, for example. And so inclusive design not only tries to bring in that holistic perspective that we were looking at from universal design, but that's where we're also starting to map out different aspects of all of the characteristics that a human has. So in other words, what we may see is that we're layering in their aspects around the gender that they have. Maybe there's some trauma-informed design we may consider. They may have multicultural aspects we want to be able to think about, their socioeconomic background, or their age or generational situation. So these are all multiple factors that can inform who we are and how we approach what we're doing. I want to be intentional, though, about asking you to not just minimize people in terms of their demographics, because sometimes that means that we're simplifying people into various categories, and that means that we're not understanding the complexity of what they're living with. And by intentionally considering all of those components and the ways that they would be interacting with the spaces, we're intentionally aiming to make sure that the designed place responds to the users in the most respectful manner as possible. So I'm hoping that that as a start in your design practice, that you will consider designing for everybody and not just make assumptions that your designs will respond to everybody. So you can open up your shift of your perspective by thinking about how can more people than are traditionally being thought of, being traditionally considered, being included for this design for all approach. So one of the ways to be able to do that would be a co-design process with the users who are traditionally not included in a lot of design processes. Now, this is not a focus of this conversation today, but I think, and it's quite a complex one in terms of how to do this. But what I do want to give you is a couple of tips. So when I go back to examining architecture education and architectural schools in terms of the processes of doing this, um, there is a minimal amount of education or training that's done in terms of learning how to engage with the users and capture their stories, capture their experiences, to be able to work with them in terms of examining what the initial issues are or situations are with a particular context. This is not something that designers are traditionally taught how to do. And so I would encourage folks within a firm or as individual designers to reach out and to learn from our colleagues. And so we have a lot of examples that we can turn to in fields like sociology, in terms of ethnographic exploration. There's a lot of work that's done in terms of public participation or engagement activities. And I want to also think about the world of storytelling and narratives. And in each one of those different realms, and there's more beyond that, there are different mechanisms that we use to be able to capture stories, to be able to capture experiences, to know how to distill them in certain ways, to be able to reflect back or work with the users to be able to say, is this what you need? Is this what you want? Now, I know that a lot of firms do initial engagement activities and then capture those in a, for example, what you've heard document. Part of the research that I've done recently is taking a look at those documents and then seeing where the information that's in there actually gets translated and appears in the decision making, the design decision making that happens subsequently, or where does it get lost? And unfortunately, it doesn't always inform that process very well. The reasons why are interesting. I think so. And it's typically because the people that are in the space that are making those design decisions are not the ones who have that information top of mind. So designers and technical people are trained to keep certain thoughts or ideas or informations rolling through their brains so that they're constantly checking the information that they're getting against that information. And that's what they use to make their decisions, which is why it's so important to have the users in that same decision-making conversation, because they're the ones who have their information top of mind. And they're the ones that are using their information to be able to filter it in some way or to assess and analyze those decisions to make sure that they're going to work for people. So how that happens is, of course, something that's interesting, and there's a lot of work that's being done on how to develop successful and meaningful and productive co-design processes. I think of the IPD process is one that's getting close to that, or at least trying to be respectful of the user experience. And I want to say to you that the user that I'm talking about is different than the client in a lot of scenarios. Okay, don't lump the two together as one stakeholder group. They can be different people in different regards. Sometimes the clients are people who have the labored experience, so they work with the users, but the users are ones who have their own lived experience. So in this particular case, there is a lot of depth that can go into this. The frustration that I continue to hear from my design colleagues, and I hear you as you're probably thinking this right now, is that you're saying to me, there's no space in the fees to be able to do this. I don't have enough time. The client doesn't want to build this in. I don't know what to do with this. This is outside of the typical services that we offer. And I understand that, and I hear you. So I try to work with various different parties to encourage this to happen, because when it does happen, I see that the final products are more successful. So I try to work with the users themselves to advocate for this. I try to work with the client representatives to say it's really important for you to have a product that is going to reflect and best serve the users that you have, and it'll more successfully align with the strategic vision that you have, that your organization is hoping to realize, and that you're hoping that this capital project is going to deliver on that. And then working with the design teams as well to develop the processes and the mechanisms and the tools and the approaches to be able to do this. And then ultimately the evaluation plan afterwards to be able to see how this did deliver something. And where I think that this fits in terms of the justification for doing this work is that I turn back to the disability mantra, which is nothing about us without us. And I add the phrase to that, which says, in the way that works for us. And what I mean by that is that it's not enough that somebody says, I'm going to have an engagement activity and I'm going to do these prescribed sets of exercises and I'm going to do these things that I typically do, and that's going to be sufficient. We wouldn't use a screwdriver to saw a piece of wood. And so sometimes the tools that are selected to do this engagement activity is not they're not exactly the right ones that work for the user group that we're having. And I want to say that co-design is a little bit more than engagement. It's also about examining a process where we're looking at sharing and distributing the decision-making power through a number of different bodies so that we can make sure that the end result works as effectively and most successfully for the end users. And remember, we're going above and beyond, is it just safe and can it function? We want to get to that point where inhabitants of that space really do enjoy themselves, where we do have positive psychosocial benefits from this place. So let's consider what else that could be. Now, I want to just step back. Well, not back. I want to also give you this, this reminder that one of the best places where you could go today to get information about accessible design are these two documents. Please, while we're here and you've got your laptop open beside you or your phone, go immediately, Google these two documents, get these two PDFs, download them, put them on your worktop so that you start working with them immediately. So Canadian Standards Association has endorsed these particular documents. There have been many dedicated professionals and people living with disabilities who have worked for many years to be able to collect and distill the research that's available, and also collecting and distilling the stories of lived experiences in order to be able to understand how it can be compiled into a series of standards that we really hope will be adopted by the National Building Code in the future to be considered. They already are endorsed, pardon me, by Accessibility Standards Canada. They're used, they're recognized at a federal level. This is, I would say, the best current information that we have to be able to understand the level of meaningful access that we should be designing our spaces for. So B651 and B65223 are available. They're public use. They're presented very similar to the way that the National Building Code is set up, and there's additional information to be able to explain what the documentation is, or pardon me, the dimensions are that are in there. Now, why I want you to why I believe that those additional notes in there are so important is because I was working with somebody, a design firm, to be able to incorporate some of this information into their firm and get them to start thinking with a little bit more of an inclusive mindset. And I had a junior designer, somebody who had been working, 5 or 6 years ish out of school, and they turned to me and said, I've always seen these numbers in the building code, but I've never really understood what they are. I apply the codes and the standards every day in my work, but it wasn't until I learned about universal design and it got me remembering that there's actually people behind these numbers, that these numbers are not just, literally pulled out of the air, that they're actually well thought out. They're deliberately crafted numbers that are representations of a diversity of experiences that people have. And that the reason for these numbers is because we're trying to work towards making a difference for somebody's life out in the world. It isn't just about numbers that we're putting on a drawing to make sure that we can then get the permits to be able to build the building. There is a greater good that we're trying to achieve as a result of the numbers. And I want you to remember that I'm hoping that that's the ultimate purpose that everybody is working towards. So when I've spent a lot of time interviewing designers about how they interpret the dimensions and what they work in, and I want to share a couple of stories with you about how they apply them. So firstly, the old turning radius. So what I see oftentimes, first of all, is, code will come up with a number and you have an icon in your software package, and you go through your space, and this is that accessible design translation exercise I was saying earlier. So you design the space, and then you take that that icon of the circle, the turning radius, and you basically, cut and paste it into these spaces, and you're squeezing it into some of the spaces that you've designed. And what I want you to think is that every time you try to squeeze it into a space, what you're really doing is asking a human to squeeze themselves into that space. And that's where the frustration comes in. So when we go to B651, you'll see that the turning radius recommendations are actually more ample than that. They're more generous than that. And the reason is not because we want to frustrate people or we want to get them mad or we're asking for more than we believe is necessary, but it's actually because people need enough space to be able to turn comfortably without worrying about bashing into walls or into equipment or even getting caught up or hooked up on something. And what when I was when I was working with designers, one of the assumptions that I realized or I heard from them was that they all thought that mobility devices were basically the same idea, and they didn't think, or they didn't have the awareness that mobility devices come in a whole bunch of sizes. So we have power chairs that are quite large. We have some that tip. They need different spaces. We have people who travel through spaces with service animals who are beside them, or even scooters. Those all need a little bit more space. And the other thing is that designers don't often understand the actual performance, the ballet that happens in some spaces, and how the layout of that space actually can make a difference for how somebody maneuvers through it. So it isn't just a checklist of, as long as I've got these particular elements there, everything's fine. There's more nuanced understanding of how some of these spaces work. And by just providing the minimum might not be enough. Because of the configuration of them, you might actually need more space. So in this way, when you're thinking of it more so this way, you're actually making sure that when you put that turning radius diagram in your drawing, and you're saying that that space is accessible for people to use it, you're actually making sure that it is accessible for them to be able to use. Okay, the other example that I want to just talk about a little bit are ramps. So I remember from school the 1 in 12 mantra. Just remember that, ramp should be 1 in 12. But what I remember for myself, or what I realized for myself, and what I've learned when I'm working with other designers, is that they often don't remember that there's actually a whole bunch of other information that goes with that ratio, that relationship. If you go to ADA and you're reading it clearly, what it's asking is that that slope of 1 in 12 is the maximum that it should be. It's not the target of what we're hoping to design. We shouldn't say to ourselves, well, a slope should be 1 in 12. What we want to remember is that that's the absolute most upper limit that we should be thinking about. It's the do not go past this number. So then what does that mean for us as we're designing? Well, ideally, we want to go much lower than that. But how low is too low? Well, remember, if we're thinking about universal design principles, we want to make sure that people can get into the building, and in this case, on a sloped surface with as much comfort and not using very much extra effort to be able to do so. Well, what we've heard as we were working with a variety of different kinds of users who benefit from ramps or sloped surfaces is that 1 in 15 is sort of the top end of the comfortable range for folks, and that really a 1 in 20 surface or slope is one that works much better. So think about when you're laying out your building, right from the very, very beginning, even when you're looking at site selection, these kinds of factors can make or break it. It's not enough that you put a building down and then try to design the ramp in afterwards. Thinking about how a building is sitting in the ground makes a huge difference. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that we recognized, I want to say, in the last year, and this is some of my colleagues who are trying to let me just go back a second. One of my colleagues has been commissioned to be able to look at a whole space, a whole new neighborhood, and design all of the buildings that are there to have zero threshold, flush entrances, and full basement. So these are mostly residential buildings that are there, and there's also some community buildings and such. So it's a little neighborhood that they're designing. And it actually, in order to be able to meet those requirements, one of the things that is impacting that is the civil engineering. So the location of the services that are going to this particular site now dictate or impact the fact that those two requirements of the project cannot be realized as successfully as we wanted. So this is why when we're thinking about some of these questions, we really need to go back to the very beginning and make sure that some of those literally the barriers to us being able to do this have been addressed from the very beginning. So today, before you hit your leave meeting button, I want to also take the opportunity for you to think about some other things in terms of being able to design more inclusively or design more accessibly. And one of them is to talk. I want to take a couple of minutes, if I can, to be able to talk about disability stigma. So disability stigma is pervasive in our popular culture. The idea of ableism is still pervasive in our culture. We see it showing up in a whole variety of different contexts. For those of us that were watching the Olympics and the Paralympics, we were seeing, even in terms of the language that was there, one Paralympic athlete came out in the media and he was saying, you know, the media talks about me saying that I'm a participant in the Paralympics. He said, no, I'm an athlete. And just as my colleagues in the Olympics are athletes, they're competing to get a medal. They're competing with the other athletes that are there. And he said, I'm not a participant. I'm not just showing up and hanging out in an event. I'm competing with the same determination that anybody else is. And so we don't want to see that patronizing approach for people that are experiencing that have disabilities. We don't want to say, oh, isn't it? We don't want to start off by saying, I pity you. I have an emotional response to the fact that you are different. And therefore, doesn't it make me feel good that I'm providing something for you? It's not about you. And people's disabilities don't exist to make other people feel better. They just want to go through life. It's about addressing the fact that we also make assumptions about how everybody works. And one of the things that I was commonly seeing in a lot of, especially younger designers, is that they're projecting onto the designs their own ideas about how a space would work or what they would like to see in a space, and believing that that's going to benefit everybody as a result. And it does take a level of maturity and I want to say life experience to be able to expand that perspective, to see beyond um, the automatic assumptions that one has, that this is what, this is what typically people would experience when they're in this. So one example may be that, I'm in Alberta and we marvel about how fantastic the sunshine is here all the time, especially in the winter. Even though we have fewer hours, it's bright and we have big skies. And a lot of people come to Alberta because they love the brightness. So then we assume when we're designing that we want to make sure there's lots of natural light that gets into a space and the space is really bright and we can go from there. So I will tell you from personal experience. I mean, this is my place. I grew up here. I hate the sun. And the reason is because the way that my eyes work, I can't process light the same way that people typically do. And so bright spaces are actually problematic. But how many times have designers gone through and thought, oh, yes, I need to make sure that we have a balance of spaces, or that we're considering that not everybody loves bright light the same way? We do that for everything that we're designing. And we have to be careful that we're considering that the design solution that we provide, that one option that we're providing, is going to work for everybody that's in that space. And so in this particular case, we often recommend that there are options. There are in situ options that are parallel, or that they're balanced in the sense that they're immediately adjacent to each other, and they're available for people to determine what it is that they will need and will work for them. And not just that we continue as designers to lay it over and assume that the one design solution that I have for you is the one that's going to work for you. The other thing that I want to remind you is that we already know that there's a certain number of basic architectural features or elements that, when they are in our environment and they're designed well and that they're located well and that they operate well, they work for us. And so we're going to ask you to please use them. Please don't try to disguise them or hide them, or maybe because you believe that they're ugly, or that some people have reactions to the fact that, oh, I don't want to be reminded that there are people with disabilities in our world. They're really, really necessary for us to be able to use well. So you would never see urban designers, for example, change traffic lights um, because they don't like the way that they're designed, or hide stop signs behind some landscapes because they feel that they're too pedestrian. They don't want them to be shown. These are important features that we have in our space in order for us collectively to know that they're going to work well. And we don't want to diminish these features. What we're asking is that you learn how important that they are. Hopefully you embrace them. And the reality is, if they're not working well, then no design that's produced, it doesn't matter how many awards that it wins, is actually going to be a good design. So consider those, please. Those are some of the first things that I want you to think about in your journey to start developing yourself as a Design for All ally. I would like you to remember that everybody, regardless of who we are, wants to be treated as a whole person. We want to be treated with respect, with dignity. Each person, especially in our Western culture, we want to have our own independence. So please, regardless of anybody's disability, remember to speak directly to that person. Shake their hand. Treat them as you would with every other person. The next portion of my presentation, what I'm going to do is I've pulled a couple of different, I want to say, trends or different contexts, and I'm going to start looking at them with you critically to be able to see why these are sometimes lauded as fantastic design ideas, but in fact, they're not really the best accessible solution. Now, ideally, we would all go off mute and we would share with each other in some way. but we might not do that today, or we might do that at the end of the presentation. You can bring up ideas. So let's take a look at this first one. This is the strand. I often marvel at students when they first see these, usually in photographs, and immediately they respond to them thinking that they're fantastic. Look at it, it's one design solution that addresses all of the issues that I've got, and it fits with all of the requirements that I have, and I think it's such a interesting idea that I'm going to try to insert it actually in a project. I'm going to see what I can do. And I think at the time, there was probably a lot of thought into it, depending on the different applications. And we, of course, learn. And this is what I encourage the design profession to continue to go back to projects and learn from them, learn with the users to find out what's going on here. So in fact, what we found out is that these are not really very great for folks. Who are they not great for? Well, one of the things that's important for humans in general is we really like predictability, which is partly why when we're asking for a run of stairs to be built, that they are every stair itself is the same dimensions, because our body starts to learn, the first couple of steps that I go down, oh yes, this is what I'm predicting, and so therefore I can now focus on other things and I can manage all the way down the flight of stairs. Descending stairs, I don't know if you knew this, there is a microsecond in descending stairs where you are actually free falling, where you've projected off of the one step, you're in midair before you actually, your lower foot lands on the stair underneath. And so that's why going downstairs is highly problematic if they aren't set up well. So in this particular case, every step might be the same, but then you've got these intermediary ramps that are intersecting in that. The issue doesn't necessarily come into play when the landings of the ramp are level. It comes into play when now you've asked somebody to descend in one direction, they're stepping onto a sloped surface, they're going in a different direction, they have to recalibrate themselves and stand upright in order to be able to descend the next set of steps. And that body motion is, it messes with our sense of balance in our head. And you haven't provided anything to support them in that oscillating movement, such as a handrail going down. So there's one factor. That is even for an able-bodied person. This is just a natural occurrence that happens. If you're busy, you're on your phone, you're talking to somebody, you're not paying attention, there are no visual indicators of any kind, no clues in this homogeneously designed environment to be able to tell people, hey, in front of you, there's a change in the direction of what's happening in the land, in the plains. And you should probably have a heads up that something different is happening to prepare your body for it. So that's nothing that's available. Somebody who is visually impaired and uses a cane, they've learned through practice different ways to be able to navigate the environment. And of course, they're always trying to take the information that they have learned previously and apply that onto new contexts. And in this particular case, there's so much going on that it could be just additionally confusing. So it's like, why there's nothing, there's no tactile indicators, there's nothing at the top of the stairs that are telling them that this is happening. Finally, they hit a set of stairs, either at the top or the bottom, and they start navigating through, and then they hit this slope, might not make sense, They might be able to detect beyond that to get to a new set of steps. And you're adding in all of this layer of information that they're trying to visualize mentally to be able to figure out how to navigate through it. Even for people with low vision, like I said, there's no color contrast, there's no tactile information there to tell them, here's the safest path for you to navigate through in order to be able to go from point A to point B. And then, of course, this was supposed to be designed for people who use mobility devices to be able to ascend and descend. So does it work? Oh, not in any regard. So even going beyond thinking about the slope, the edges of the particular paths, the slope paths are not protected in the sense that it's easy for somebody to go off in the wrong direction. There are no edges on it to be able to stop somebody from, say, wheeling too far forward or in a direction and having a bumper on some regard. They don't necessarily know how far that slope is, quite a long distance for them to be able to go without hitting that brake. If they are doing it manually, are there additional handrails for them to help pull themselves up? There's too many things that are complex in this particular case where something that looks really interesting doesn't actually work as well as it could. So here's another example of a scenario, and it's maybe not as common as an example, but I do see similar things being done. And that is where we have the installation of public art that's put into place. And kudos, thank you. Public art is always amazing. Let's make sure we consider the multisensorial aspects or characteristics of that, because we want all of that multisensorial information to align and be coordinated and tell the same message so that the receiver of any one of that sensory information is not confused in any regards by other information, or they're not thinking of something differently. So in this particular case, this is on the left-hand side is the interior of a building, of a lobby that has this little inlaid metal strip that goes through it, and it is tactilely perceivable. In other words, you can feel that it's there, but it's not high enough for it to be like a tripping hazard. So when I first saw this, I thought, oh my goodness, we have a building that's actually got a tactile directional indicator, and it can tell people where they're supposed to go in the space. And in fact, it doesn't do that at all. It is purely just a decorative feature that's in the space, which doesn't support people who could benefit from having a tactile directional indicator, as we see on the right-hand side. So these are architectural elements that are part of information that is being transmitted to people who can benefit from it, not only people who can detect, but just generally. I've seen them not just in this particular case, it's inlaid metal strips, but they can also be color coded, and people can use them in context for wayfinding. Say a tourist comes to a city and they want to be able to know how to do a walking loop, or that a route is identified as being entirely accessible for a particular degree. They can be used as a tool to be able to enhance somebody's experience to be able to navigate through the space. So be conscientious when you're applying some of these features that you think are playful or fun or delightful or artistic, and understand that they can also be used in other ways. They can be interpreted in other ways. They can be experienced in other ways. And to be able to understand those other ways means that you're additionally designing so that you're supporting somebody's experience in that particular context. This last example is one that I think is ubiquitous. And these are the social stairs. And as I had a colleague tell me the other day, he said, there is almost no post-secondary context now when we when we're not able to include these. They're almost a prerequisite for a lot of different contexts. And yet, I don't think that we've had the critical conversation yet about these spaces entirely. Even not only the stairs themselves, but also where they're located in a particular space. So oftentimes they're part of an entry. You come in the grand entrance. It's part of the aha, the big wow factor that we're always trying to inject in particular designs. Unfortunately, I think that gets reinforced through a lot of the television shows, the DIY shows, the makeover shows. We're always wanting to include that wow factor in some regard. And I think these are an element now that are contributing to that. So you go in and you see this big set of stairs, and they're populated with people or not. But let's take a little bit of a look at them. So who can use them? Who are they intended for? And when I went back and asked you as a designer to make sure that you were not intentionally discriminating against groups, this is a perfect example of where that's happening. So you've already socially engineered the space. And I know these may seem like harsh terms in some regard, but this is how we, as folks with disabilities, are seeing this. We're saying, hang on, you've determined who you are permitting to be on that space and who's going to be excluded from it. So who can go there? Well, able-bodied people who are ambulatory, who have enough strength to be able to get up and down that space. As you see, there's only one handrail on the right-hand side. They have enough balance to be able to move through the remainder of the seating areas where they don't need any physical support to be able to do it, like another handrail or something to be able to hold against. There's nothing visually to be able to tell them where any of those volumes of spaces are. So you're asking somebody who's got really good eyesight, who can perceive all those spaces. They don't have, say, a head injury where a concussion may have happened, where the spaces are more challenging for them to be able to perceive. And while they're sitting there, you're asking that everybody sits with the same dimensions. They don't need backrests. They don't need armrests. They can go from a 90-degree sitting space, and they've got strong enough leg muscles to be able to stand straight up and not have to kick their feet under them in order to be able to get their weight redistributed so that they can push themselves up. So you're asking that, you're saying that somebody needs to have a whole series of physical characteristics in order to be able to participate in this context. And you're also saying, well, look, it's part of the circulation system. So what happens if I can't use that space? It's too dizzy. I'm too dizzy. I can't walk up and down that particular stairs. Where's the alternative in the immediate environment for me to be able to go from the ground floor to that mezzanine level without, given that I can't use this particular set of stairs? So be careful that you're not segregating out people and that you're not intentionally dividing the space in such that only some people can participate and other ones can't. So this wraps up my journey that I've gone through with you today to give you some things to think about, some things to ponder, some things hopefully that you can adopt soon, that you can start integrating into your everyday practice. And I'm also hoping that there are things that maybe got you thinking. There even some things maybe that might be a little bit prickly that you then take to your colleagues and or take home and you say, I want to talk this through. I was reacting to this, or I was wondering about this. I want to be able to explore more about that. And always ask questions. There are lots of people out in our environment, people around us who have many different experiences. And please, I continue to invite you at whatever point of your career that you're in to keep learning, keep asking, keep being curious, and in that process always continue to be respectful, because we know that collectively we can all work towards making Canada a much more inclusive place, especially in terms of its built realms, so that everybody can have a really high quality of life. So I want to thank you very much. I'm going to have just a sip of water, and then I'm going to turn to the questions, the Q&A, where I hope that you will have some things that you would like to talk about. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you.
Perfect, Lara. Thank you very much for your presentation. And this is just a reminder for our members. If you have any questions, now is the time. Please post them into the Q&A window. Lara is going to address all these questions now. Thank you. And Laura, so far there are no questions, so I believe it was a cohesive and coherent presentation.
Well, thank you.
One question has just been posted, Laura.
Thank you, Mark, for your question. Do I have any suggestions to encourage clients to engage user groups? And one of the things that I often ask clients when they come in, sometimes they already have a package of material for the design team to start working on. And what I will do when I'm working with project teams is to say, can we look at the engagement material that you have already done, the engagement activities that you've already done? Can we just get a sense of what you did in order to be able to make sure that the information that you have is as robust or as meaningful? Of course, in different terms, I don't want to imply that they don't have it, but I want to be able to review with them what they did in order to compile that information coming forward. Sometimes I have found that in reviewing it with them, we'll find out things like they may have talked to management, they may have talked to staff, but they haven't talked to, say, residents of a project, if this is like a care facility, or they haven't figured out how to get the user feedback. It may be that they're doing a mall, for example. We're talking to the operations people, we hear from them, but then we don't actually ever talk to anybody who's shopping there, or the frontline retail workers, to find out what their needs are. And so just I would approach all of this work with curiosity. So, could you please tell me about what you've done? Did you hear from this group? What's going on? And as we're unpacking that work, we find they're getting the aha moments of whether they're missing some of those stakeholder groups, usually the users. So at that point, then I'll say, okay, hopefully this is important. We want to make sure that this project is relevant for them. What would you like to do in order to be able to capture that information? Sometimes we don't have a lot of budget or time to be able to do that. That's when I'll turn to already existing sources of information to see if any of that can inform that conversation. They may already have some information internally, they didn't know it. We want to be able to quickly analyze that to see how we can convert that information into supporting material for the design decisions. Or we may want to go out actually and plan for there to be some sort of activities or even a campaign of some kind to be able to get that information available to do that. So once again, you're practicing that co-design approach, which is that you're working in this case with the client, but you want to be able to have them feel like they're opening up to some sort of process where they're making sure that the users are engaged. The last piece I want to say to this is sometimes the clients have said, well, it's like really impossible to get information from people. And I promise you that we can always get information in some way. I've specialized so I'm doing my doctoral studies right now, and I've specialized in how do we get that information from people who are, have poor communication and they have cognitive decline. They can still get information to us about their lived experience. And we just need to be able to approach the scenario differently, which is partly why I go back to that analogy that, a screwdriver doesn't always work when you're cutting wood. We often will think that there's just a series of tools that we have to just activate, but they're not always the best ones that work for that particular group. And so we want to be able to make sure that we craft a process that is going to work with folks in some way. The other thing, I realize there's one more piece that we could do to be able to encourage clients to be able to engage with users is that sometimes buildings are being built for spec and they don't always know who the users are. They may have done a little bit of profiling for their marketing piece that they have for their building. And so they know roughly about the target kind of audiences that they're hoping that will come to and inhabit the building. We can still do more work in terms of capturing that story, those experiences, and bringing them in some way. We can still do it at a little bit of a generic perspective and use that information to inform the conversations. And sometimes they already know it, right? And we're good. So that's a multi-piece conversation. Okay, the next question that I have is, has there ever been a survey or questionnaire to actually ask people with disabilities their pet peeves or issues that they must put up with on a daily basis that we as designers should react to? I'm assuming that that is what the accessible codes is based on, or maybe not. Absolutely, yes. There are many conversations about what works and what doesn't work. And this is why we have things like advisory committees in organizations. There should always be some sort of continuous feedback loop in some way to be able to capture that information and then continually learn as we're doing things. So absolutely, the second part to your question is correct. So the CSA B651, B652, 23 is the process for developing those particular versions very much included multiple different layers and activities that included experiences of people with lived experience and loved experience and labored experience, to be able to make sure that we were getting multiple sources of information that could inform what those new standards were like. It's ongoing, and it has a multi-layered components to it. For anybody who's been following the development of the Accessible Canada standards as a result of the Accessible Canada, the Act that came through, that is a robust process where professionals and designers and operators and people impacted are all working collectively through minute details to be able to capture those lived experiences and convert them into information that can then inform design processes and decisions. So absolutely. That's why I recommend that you use that as your first go-to place and figuring it out, okay? There's a next question from James, a two-part question. So he says, our firm is always ready to design for all. However, until the provincial code changes come into line better with the CSA, we have many clients who are not interested in going beyond what's the current code. Always with it, do we have to? Without changing the code, it's hard for us to move forward. Yes, and it's frustrating for smaller firms. Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. And we hear this all the time. And I coach some architectural firms on that dance because it's a little bit of a dance. So in some way, this is where you can do things in your design that are going to make the design more accessible without articulating or without highlighting that in fact it is making the space better. Okay. So if you make your design so that the first draft of it already has features in it that you know are going to contribute to a greater degree of accessible design, and they're incorporated into the whole design, two things happen. One is that they're integrated seamlessly and it's part of a whole design that's happened, and they're not flagged in some way as, oh, that's the architecture or that's the accessible features that are there. And secondly, by integrating these things at the earliest possible point, you actually are lowering your costs. So there is a good study that was done in terms of the cost differentials of what it costs to build to a very high degree of accessible design. And as simple as considering a series of factors at the design phase costs you less than 1% more in terms of the overall project the overall budget of the project. So for example, you could say, we're going to locate all of the building controls in a particular location that is within both standing and seating reach distances. That doesn't really cost very much. You're just saying, here's the new height of where they're going to be located on the wall. And you're putting them in a location where you can be more assured that the space that's in front of those controls is always going to be clear, and not that people are going to hide things in front of them or shove, a plant. So we for example, we'll see that a lot of fire poles are kind of tucked in the corner, and then somebody will put a plant in front of it. So not only do you not see the fire pole, but it's hard to get up to it to pull the fire pole. So those are really examples of really basic things. So though, and I will include those in the follow-up. I will include links to those 2 pieces of research for you, so you've got those and you can review those, okay? The next question is there standards for consulting to gather useful information and have advocates involved through the process to occupation? So there are no standards, I want to say, but you, oh, no, there are best practices that are developed. And where, so, okay, let me compose my answer to this. So first of all, we want to think of the guiding approach has been developed by the International Association for Public Participation. They have a spectrum of public engagement, and it clearly articulates the different kinds of engagement that you would have with users to be able to contribute to decision making. So that's a first look, and I will include that for you. The other place that I would say that I have gone to in my work to be able to learn as much as I can is actually looking at public health and medical literature, medical research literature. So what I'm seeing there is there's a lot of conversation around patients being informed and advocating for themselves and being active partners in decision making for their own care. And so we want to look at the mechanisms and the processes that are involved in the relationships between all of those players, how information is captured, transmitted between the different parties. Because as you can imagine, just as in architecture with the jargon and lingo that happens, in the medical context, there's jargon and lingo that happens. And so we want to make sure that the parties understand each other and the language is understood. And we want to make sure that the power relationship that happens in that one is valuable. So there are some fantastic recent papers that have been written by patient families and caregivers to be able to articulate their experience, to say, we participated in these contexts where we thought they were patient-centered, because that's the language that the institution is using. But in fact, here's what we experienced, and we would code it as tokenism. So I will add that one to the list for you, because I think they did this most recent one, they did such a good job of clearly articulating their experience, and they give ideas about how to then craft what you need to in order to have that respectful relationship. The other thing I want to say in answer to Anonymous is that there are people who do this. Like, this is part of what I do in my work. There are lots of people like me who are trained to know how to do this dance. Because I know that architecture schools and practices don't teach somebody how to do this to the degree that it could happen at. The other thing that I'm seeing, there are different cultural contexts where the cultures are demanding that in some way. They're saying, this is part of what we do culturally, and so we're expecting you to join us in this way. And we see firms responding to that. And I'd love designers to also respond in the same way to people with disabilities. Okay, Binal's asking, CSA B651 and B652, is this the national standards? Can I use this for the guideline to understand the National Building Code for more better than the exam? So the answer is no. It is a national standard in terms of this is what we are aiming for. The provincial government, pardon me, let me retract that. The federal government has said this is the standard that we're applying for all of our federally, our buildings under federal jurisdiction. And this is what we are aiming for in terms of having it be regulatory. So it's not a regulatory document. It does not replace the National Building Code. It doesn't replace what's in the National Building Code. They're still two separate documents. So this is what I was referring to earlier. Now there's a group of people who, some of them worked on the development of these new versions. They are part of an implementation team that is actively working to understand how to bridge those two documents. So they're trying, so just as there's the harmonization conversations that are happening between the national and the provincial and territorial levels, we're also having conversations to see how can this other information be included in the National Building Code. So right now they're separate. But what I want to say to you is if you use B651 and B652 as your go-tos, they won't, you won't have anything in the code that is undermined because of that, okay? That answers your question. And Anonymous says, how does one deal with conflicting requirements for accessibility, such as holding onto the handrails with both hands and a ramp wide enough to accommodate larger mobility scooters? So this is where the CS, okay, so in general, I'm going to answer this in two parts, the general and the specific. So in general, whenever you have conflicting requirements that you're trying to, as a designer, figure out how to work that through, one of the things that I always love doing, and this is part of that co-design piece, is you take it back to the groups and you say, hey guys, help me out. So you folks over here have told me you need this, and you folks over here have told me how you need this. Let's, the multiple parties, let's work together to try to figure out how are we going to make this work between us. And one thing that you probably don't realize about people with disabilities is they are natural problem solvers, especially when it's dealing with mobility issues, but also many other issues. They're always looking at the environment to try to figure out what is it that they need to be able to address to be able to get through their daily life. So they're constantly problem solving, okay? They're also natural planners too. They're incredible in terms of planning out what they need to do in their day. So in this particular case, you're asking people to say, okay, let's figure this out. I've got these parameters, I have this, what could we do? And I can almost 100% guarantee that that conversation will result in a fruitful answer for you in some way. In terms of the second part of it, so what you can do is be reassured that a lot of those conversations have already happened in the development of B651 and B652. There have been lots of deliberations in terms of, okay, how wide are we looking at for larger devices? What's the narrowness we've got? What are the parameters that are the constricting factors that mean that different kinds of devices need to maneuver in different ways? That conversation's already happened. So before you have to turn to the users, consult those documents. If you don't have anything in those particular sources, and you've got a really particular context, that's when you can still do that co-design exercise and have folks work it through in their own regard, okay? Is there any other, sorry, I think I've got all standard for consulting, okay. And Tom has got a question for me here. The OBC does not address accessibility in the fire alarm situation where the elevator is not functioning and the stairs are the only operation. No, this is something that sucks. Building codes do not address safe egress of people who who have mobility challenges, or in a lot of cases, different disabilities. So you're right, you are not required to address that in any particular situation. We're not looking at where the fire alarms are. We're not looking at where people are located. We're not looking at communication systems so that they understand what's happening in a particular context so that they can get information about it or communicate with somebody. We're not looking at context of where, how do we physically get people out? Can they do it on their own? Do they have to wait for somebody? This is why B651 talks about it. There's a system for egress, number one. Number two is there is through the Accessible Canada Act, there is there was a whole bunch of work that was done around safe egress in buildings. If you're looking at that as a topic specifically, those that policy, those technical guidelines have been developed, so you can go to sorry, I'm just making a note to myself to give you that information as well. So you can go through those systematically as well and see what the most recent recommendations are for that high degree of design solutions that are available. Okay. And yes, Tom says stairs, space of refuge. Sometimes there are carrying chairs available, but not mandated. Yes, evacuation chairs are one piece. The chair, so there are multiple different answers, Tom, to where an area of refuge can be. And it doesn't have to be in the stairs, but the key is that we know where the person is and that there's an accompanying system of communication there so that not only do we identify that the person's there, but they also know what's going on. Because I want you to think that if you're sitting in the stairs, you're parked in the corner of the stairs and you've watched everybody go down the stairs, and then you're sitting in an empty stairwell and you have no idea what's going on, and stairs don't have very good communication in them, the best Wi-Fi in them. And I promise you that in a moment where the fire alarms are going and even the calmest person, you may naturally start panicking a little bit. Your senses are heightened, and you probably are going to feel like every minute that goes by is an eternity and you don't know what's going on. And so even that system of communication to just find out, yes, somebody knows that I'm there. Yes, somebody's coming. No, there's no fire in your area of the building. Something is really important to be able to calm people down. We want to be able to consider we did consider all of those components in the development of that. So sorry, I'm half still writing down. Are there any, we still have a couple of minutes left. So if there's any other questions, please enter it in. I'm still scrolling down. Well, I'm just going to respond to say to Tom's comment that one is more important than an adult change table. I think that there's value in both. It depends on the context. We plan to make the entire space as meaningful as it can be for people. So I want to thank you as a wrapping up statement. I want to thank you very much for coming and participating today. I really appreciate that. You are welcome to, get in touch with me directly if you need to, if you have questions. And if you don't, that's great. I hope you did have something to take away today. And I encourage you all to continue learning and continue to exploring how you can contribute to make Canada as inclusive as possible. So thank you very much.
Excellent. No, thank you, Lara. Thank you very much for a great webinar and discussion today. And also thanks to everyone who attended today. And as we conclude this webinar, I would like to draw your attention to some announcements. The next webinar takes place next week on the 19th of September with the title Usage of 8I and IR Imaging in Energy Efficient Retrofits. The OAA will report your participation in this webinar to your transcript. So therefore, please note that there is no need for individual reporting on your part. Additionally, all attendees will soon receive the presentation file via email along with a link to submit your feedback. Once again, thank you very much for your attendance and have a productive and pleasant remainder of your day. Thanks again, Lara, very much, and bye-bye.